Welcome to the Web Authentication 101, Demystifying Web Authentication, in South Seas CDF with Christian Brand. Before we begin, I have a few brief notes. Stop by the business hall located in Mandalay Bay, Oceanside, and Shoreline ballrooms on level 2 during the day and for the welcome reception at 5:30 p.m. The Black Hat Arsenal is in the business hall on level 2. Lunch will be served in Bayside AB from 1 p.m. to 2:30 p.m. And don't forget the merchandise store on level 2 and session recordings. They have a deck on every level. And thank you for putting your phones on vibrate. It makes us easier to ignore the ringing. Christian, it's all yours.
Thank you, Lena. Hi, folks. Good morning. I'm Christian Brand. I work on the security and identity teams at Google. And one of my areas is web authentication and FIDO, which I hope to tell you a little bit more about in the 25 minutes we have this morning. Thank you for being here early. I know it's the first session of the day, and after last night, I'm surprised to see as many here, but this is great. Who here has heard of web authentication or FIDO before? Okay, great. So every year this gets better and better. I've never spoken at a Black Hat before, but I get around in the circuit a little bit, and it started, I guess, 5-6 years ago with almost no one, and I think now we're roughly at the 40 or 50% mark. So hopefully for next year we'll kind of keep that trajectory going. So the agenda this morning is starting with a little bit of background, why we're even doing this stuff, like why we're interested in trying to solve some problem, what problem are we solving, why is this important. I think about, judging from the hands here, about 40-50% of folks should already probably know why we're working on this stuff, but really the TLDR there is just passwords are just not enough, right? We need to do something to fix the problem. Then we'll go into the industry solution to that problem a little bit, MFA, multi-factor authentication, something industry has come up with to try and address this problem. Still not kind of quite there. If you saw Ellie's presentation yesterday, you'll know that phishing is still a giant issue, and even the best forms of MFA, in some cases, can still be circumvented, so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then lastly, we'll talk about why you're all here, right? We'll talk about web authentication and what we're doing to try and address this problem as an industry. So let's start with the first section, passwords are not enough. So some of the statistics may be very familiar to you, or you already have a sense for this. I mean, not a week goes by today that we don't learn about another data breach somewhere. So 4.3 billion credential dumps or credentials leak and dumps is something that would come naturally. You'd think, yeah, sure. We set up the Google search crawlers a while ago to kind of go out looking for username password pairs, and that's what we found. Over 4.3 billion unique combinations online, and stuff that's out there and can be used or misused in some way, shape, or form. What we've also found is that between various different websites, so for the same user IDs, passwords get reused at a minimum about 17% of the time. We actually think in practice that's much higher, but from the data that we could gather, about 17% of the time it turns out that users on different services or across different services ends up reusing the same username and password pairs. Of course, not great, and that's why password managers has been something that's on the rise, still very low, but we hope that folks will actually end up using these services more, because password reuse is probably like one of the kind of the Achilles heel right now of the internet authentication industry as far as passwords are concerned. And then I'm happy to report, I'm up here as Google, right? So 110 million accounts proactively resecured. So what's really cool about us looking for these credential dumps is if we then see matching passwords for Google accounts, things that work on Google side, we can proactively secure these accounts and reach out to those users and say, hey, your password has been compromised somewhere else, and it turns out that you use the same password here, you should probably think about resetting the thing. So, things that one can do if you have access to all this data, which obviously not all services do have. Again, happy to report that even if a bad guy has your valid Google username and password and they're trying to use it in a, kind of a brute force type attack against Google trying to sign in over 99.9% of the cases, we actually will not allow that attacker into your Google account. And maybe you've seen some of these emails come by that says, hey, there was just a login to your Google account that we've blocked from some other place on earth. We don't think it's legitimate. Click here, like to reset your Google password. So we can discern patterns from folks trying to log into different places, or logging from different places and using different techniques. And when something doesn't quite feel right, although the bad guy might have your username, they might have your password, in some cases, and 99.9% of the cases, and a little more than that, we actually still are able to block those kind of attempts because we have such a kind of breadth of knowledge, and we see various different things going on the internet. Now, what this presentation is about today is the 0.1%. It's talking about what can we do to actually try and secure the 0.1% in this case, because at the scale at which we operate and the scale at which some of you folks operate, that 0.1% is still very significant. And normally, the accounts that really matters a lot are in that 0.1%, right? Think reporters, politicians, like C-level execs at companies, right? That's normally the folks that fit into that 0.1%. So anyway, in the rest of the presentation, we are going to focus on the things that can't be solved using kind of automated measures right now. What can you as a IT professional, or you as an administrator, or you as an individual do to try and curb this problem? So sources of stolen passwords, we've already kind of spoken about this a little bit. Phishing, of course, the #1 threat out there, and I'll back that up with some numbers here shortly. If you've seen the presentation yesterday, you'll also know that phishing is on the rise, phishing is on the up and up. That's one of the lowest hanging fruits for bad guys right now to get hold of active credentials. And also yesterday was shown that if someone actually gets hold of a username and password pair via phishing, your account is 463 times more likely than the average account to get hijacked. So a lot of interesting statistics. If you didn't see that presentation, please go online and look at it later. I think it's also available at Ellie's website. But a lot more details about why phishing is a problem over there. He'll just do a very quick recap since we have some other stuff to get to. Keyloggers, another issue, right? Keyloggers actually not, the most important thing any longer, and we'll look at that in a second here as well. Like the typical malware keylogger, something running on your machine where you're typing keystrokes, someone's exfiltrating it. Still a problem, but I think in the grand scheme of things, phishing is really the thing to worry about. And then lastly, data breaches, right? We looked at the statistics earlier. 4.3 billion username password pairs. Seems like every week there is one. That's really the big three sources of stolen passwords and stolen credentials right now. Where do these credentials come from, right? Password reuse, the single larger source, right? We keep reusing our passwords from service to service. As we said yesterday, and I'll say it again today, phishing, the most dangerous source. Phished victims are at the highest risk to get accounts compromised because it's kind of more of a targeted thing. And then lastly, the black market fuels account compromise, right? There is a whole ecosystem that makes brokering these stolen credentials really, really easy and really lucrative. And that's really what's kind of fueling this whole system. So a couple of statistics before we really get to the meat here. 91% of information security attacks start with phishing, and 80% of attacks on businesses include phishing in one way, shape, or form. And there are some sightings down there if you want to check out the sources for these quotes. I'm kind of like saying the same thing over and over here again, like phishing, really big problem. One last slide here to kind of just back this up with, we looked at some Google Safe Browsing data, right? Google Safe Browsing, you can log into that right now and you can kind of draw the same graphs, it's all open. But for the first time in 2016, phishing actually started overtaking exploit-based malware because it is really so easy. It is trivial. It's much easier than having malware that runs on different systems. Phishing is something, it still works. We'll see one more slide if I'm correct about this in a second here, a study that Google has done that kind of further backs this up. So this is the one here, 43% there on the left, 43%. So about 1 in 2 persons, a Google study has found, still falls for phishing today. If you can create a website that looks pretty legitimate and you can get a user to, well, I guess just see some kind of a link to that website, if the message, and I want to say if the message doesn't even have to be, I guess, super legitimate as some other folks have found here, if there is some urgency in there, if a user gets sent this link and they click on it, about half of folks, 1 in 2 people will still fall for that scam and actually submit their credentials to this phishing website. And then one last quote here, 76% of account vulnerabilities were due to weak or stolen passwords. reports. And that's in the Verizon data breach report. That's a little bit dated now, but I think the latest one we have actually has this up by 5 percentage points to 81%. So anyway, a lot of stuff. I wanted to cover that as quickly as possible because really all it is background, and I'm sure most of you folks, if not all of you, already kind of knows this, either intuitively or you've seen the statistics before. So the industry is not sit still, right? We've tried to do something to address this problem. The thing we've done is we came up with multi-factor authentication, MFA or two-step verification or whatever you want to call it. But the fact is, passwords on its own is not enough anymore. We need something more. We need something else to try and make sure that the user is really the right person that's trying to log in or gain access to a service. Here's kind of a variation of a slide that was shown yesterday. Different forms of multi-factor authentication have different ways of different levels of assurance, different ways to authenticate the user at different strength levels. SMS voice still out there. A lot of the services use it. We've seen various things from NIST and other places saying that like SMS is deprecated or whatever. Cases or the reality is using any form of multi-factor authentication is still better than using none. So certainly SMS and voice is up there as one of the things that you can do to try and protect against password reuse, for example, right? If you use the same password across 5 services, but you have multi-factor authentication set up on all of them, suddenly that reused password becomes, useless to an attacker because at least there is another factor of authentication. Yes, there's issues with SMS, there's issues with voice telephone calls, but it's still a level of protection that's better than having absolutely nothing in place. Of course, there's OTP generators, TOTP, HOTP, various different standards out there. Lately, mobile push authentication. You get a message on your phone when you're trying to do an action saying, hey, is it really you? Do you want to perform this action? Click on this prompt on your phone. That's great. Usability also enhanced, makes things a lot easier for the user. They can verify on the device that it really is the action they want to perform. But the problem with all of these technologies really are, they're what we call kind of relayable by the attacker, right? So if you think about a bad guy setting up some phishing website somewhere on the internet, if that bad guy can get you to go to the phishing website, and the bad guy can get you to enter your credentials in there, and the bad guy then in real time tries that credentials against the real service, you're going to get your OTP. You're going to get prompted for your OTP. You're going to get your mobile push message on your phone, thinking it's you trying to log in. And in essence, you're going to approve that login on your phone or type in your OTP, and all you're going to do is you're going to log the bad guy in. So in essence here, all of these factors are relayable by the bad guy, and this is something that we had to stop. So in 2012, we got together with a bunch of folks in the industry, and we came up with something called FIDO U2F, which some of you are aware. FIDO U2F, the U2F stands for Universal Second Factor, is kind of a precursor to web authentication, which we're going to talk about. And the idea was to come up with a protocol that actually helps us to defeat phishing, right? So the protocol, and we'll look at that in a second here, is how it defeats phishing. It's actually very, very, very simple, but we had to come up with a protocol that stops this factor from being relayable. And that's ultimately what we're trying to come up with, and what the whole web authentication kind of underpins, is this mechanism of trying to defeat phishing. That was kind of one of the key premises here. Yes, it ended up being a physical security key in the first rendition of the protocol, because it's just something that's a little bit easier to do. Getting specs out there and getting folks to build a little tiny consumer hardware device was a little easier to do than trying to get this protocol into all different device types. But nothing really stops this protocol from being successful, even if implemented directly in a mobile phone, for example. So security keys is one way to get this problem and get the solution to this problem out there, but it's just one of the various avenues. And later in this deck, we'll talk a little bit more about that too. So obligatory kind of marketing slide. I'll skip over this. I'll just say there are security keys out there, as I've said. There are many different vendors who make fantastic security keys. Some here at the event, some not. Any security key that kind of follows the FIDO standard, U2F, FIDO2, which we'll talk about in a second here, is set out or set up to solve the phishing problem. And they all work against Google services, they all work against many other services online. So if you feel you're at risk, which I think most of you here probably at some level or another might be, it might be a good idea to investigate setting up a phishing resistant second factor for your account and using some form of a security key. Something else, as I've said, that we've launched a little earlier this year, we said, well, it's really great to have to carry around the physical security key. And by the way, after the the talk here, feel free to come up to me, or in the wrap room, I have some security keys available that I can give out if you don't have one already and you want to try it out. But instead of using your physical security key to sign in, you can also use your phone. Basically what we've done is we said, well, this protocol can also be implemented in computer to phone communication. Unfortunately, for the thing to be phishing resistant, there has to be a local communication channel. That's the crux, and we'll look at that in a second. But you have to have local communication between the device you're logging in from and your authentication factor. If you think about it, none of the other multi-factor authentication options had that, right? They were all based on relaying something through the cloud, through the internet somehow, right? So what we're doing here is we're saying there's physical connectivity. That's really how we stop the phishing. So USB security key, clearly you plug it into a USB port. The other option here of using your phone looks a lot like push authentication, but it really isn't, because there's a local communication channel between your browser and your mobile phone, and in this case using Bluetooth, or using a kind of application level pairing protocol built on top of Bluetooth, which we're also working on in the FIDO Alliance and Web Authentication. But point here is we're kind of slowly starting to make progress on moving from using physical security keys, which by the way is still very important, still is a form factor of choice for many users and enterprises, but we're moving into the place where this technology can become a reality for general consumers out there who clearly is never going to invest time and money in buying physical devices, or at least from our perspective. So how do security keys work? Let's briefly look at this. So in step number one, after I've typed in my username and my password into some kind of a service, there is a cryptographic challenge that gets sent from the server to my device on which I'm trying to log in. At that point in time, we're actually sending a request from the browser through, and the browser actually looks at the URL. It looks at the web origin where I'm trying to sign in. So at this point, I'm trying to sign into google.com. That is actually sent over a local USB channel, or NFC, or Bluetooth. It needs to be local to this particular security key, and we're also appending the challenge that the server sent in step number one. What then happens is the security key signs this challenge and the web origin, so the actual website that the user is visiting. So it cryptographically signs it with a private key that was established when I registered the security key the first time, right? So security keys in FIDO works in a way that there's only two operations of note. There's registration and there's sign, right? Getting a signature. So at t equals 0, you set up your security key with your account, you plug it in, it generates a unique public-private key pair. That's now on the security key. Any other later point in time when you want to sign in, you pull out your security key, you plug it in, and this is what happens. A challenge gets sent from the server to your device. We send that all the way through the local channel to the key. In addition to the challenge, we're also signing the web origin. So we're making sure you're visiting real google.com and not fake google.com. That gets cryptographically signed with the private key that was established. We send all of this stuff back signed, relay it from the device, the client or user agent, back to the server, and the server can validate that the user both has access to the correct private key, right, because there's a signature, and the server can validate that the user was visiting the right website at this particular point in time. That's really how we defeat phishing. It's extremely simple if you think about it. It's just adding one additional piece of information, but there are certain trusted ecosystems in this mechanism. For example, the browser who's figuring out who's calling need to be trusted in this particular model. But if you think about phishing and what's been happening and where malware kind of being on the decline and phishing being on the rise, that is something that's not totally unreasonable to assume in the current ecosystem that we're in. So this, in a nutshell, is how FIDO and web authentication works. Now, for the rest of the presentation, we'll also look at things where we're not talking about security keys particularly, but the same model always holds. This is the authentication model for FIDO. There is always a challenge, and a web origin that gets signed, and everything then gets relayed back to the server in a way to authenticate and make sure everything kind of is intact. The user has access to the right private key, and that the correct web origin was being used. So FIDO is created, and the whole solution here is created using open standards. I've used two terms interchangeably here this morning. WebAuthn from the W3C, and maybe FIDO, CTAP API. So essentially, think about it this way. There's two standards bodies that we're working in to standardize this technology. If you are a server, like if you have a web service and you want to implement any of this stuff, you're interested in the WebAuthn API, the thing from the W3C. There is a separate API that's being standardized in the FIDO Alliance, and that really is the API that talks more about how security keys interact with physical, like devices, browsers, platforms. That's more, of interest if you are a device vendor. So that's kind of the bottom part over there. So most folks here, I think, would be more interested in the WebAuthn API, which we'll talk about. But lastly, if you're curious, you can, of course, also go look at the published standards. CTAP stands for Client to Authenticator Protocol. So it's a way in which these devices kind of frame bits on the wire or in the air. So let's talk about web authentication. I gave a lot of background earlier, like how these things hang together, but I think it's very important to then also talk about the various use cases that web authentication enables. So as I said, W3C have the specification called WebAuthn that allows websites to interact with authenticators. And again, this is a different way of stating what I've just said earlier. There is a remote website, there is WebAuthn, there is a client, there's CTAP to talk to removable things, and then there's also a unspecified API for devices to talk right down to built-in biometrics and built-in authentication technologies and devices. One thing that we've announced earlier this year was saying that, hey, Android devices 7 Plus now have a built-in FIDO or WebAuthn authenticator. What does that really mean? Well, that means we now have the client, which is Android, connected up with the fingerprint sensor, so you can actually access directly from the web or from any other Android application. You can get hold of and think about it like a security key built right into the device itself, authenticated with biometrics. And in the next slide or two, we'll talk about what that actually enables, what you as a developer can do with that technology once it's all enabled, because it's not always used as a second factor, which is important. So now we get to the crux here, right? There's two use cases, two primary use cases that WebAuthn fundamentally enables. Up until this point in the presentation, I've only spoken about number one. I've spoken about bootstrapping, right? That's when I sign into a device the very first time. I type my username, I type my password, I grab my physical security key, I plug it in, and I use it as a second factor, as one more factor to make sure it's really me and I'm not visiting a phishing website. However, WebAuthn also enables a second use case, a little bit more niche, but still important use case, and that's the re-verification or the re-authentication use case. Most of you have dealt with that in your life before. If you have an iPhone from 5S, or if you have an Android device and you visit like a banking service or or specifically open their app on your phone, you know that the app sometimes offer to actually use biometrics instead of password to re-authenticate you when you come back to the application. You still have to set up the application the very first time using your traditional factors, but from then on out, you can now use biometrics or a screen lock or something to kind of show continued authentication or continued authenticity to this application. Here what we do is we actually look at web authentication for that, and we're saying that finally now we have APIs available from the web that allows you to get access to all of the built-in authentication technology on the device, not only from apps, but also get access to built-in factors directly from the web. That's kind of how it looks like. From the web, you can go via Chrome, you can now talk to the FIDO module. Applications always had direct access to biometrics in the key store, but now for the first time, you can also get access to this directly from the web application. So that's kind of like the mental model of what this built-in authenticator on Android looks like. Want to talk about two user journeys just briefly here. Meet Eliza. Eliza wants to sign into her bank. She starts on her mobile browser and then wants to enroll a fingerprint after signing. This is the model that we all know and love when we go to a banking application on our Android phone or our iPhone and we set it up the first time to use biometrics. Now we can do this directly from the web. She tries to sign in, hits the sign in button, username, password. It offers to use biometric authentication next time that she wants to use this particular web application. What we've done in the background here, and all these slides will be available, so you can go through this in much more detail. It's very simple. There is a way to figure out whether the platform that you're on supports built-in web authentication. It's this very, very long user verifying platform authenticator available call that you make, so you'd know as a service whether this is built-in. If it is built-in, then you create a public key. That's as simple as that. This platform then creates a public-private key pair. You send the public key to the server and store it, and now you have a key pair created built into the phone. So There's a bunch of different options. I'm not going to talk about it here too much. We're running out of time. I'll just say that two things are important. It needs to be built in. I don't want to talk to an external security key. I want to use an internal one, the platform authenticator, and I wanted to verify the user's identity, which is what the user verification is required set to. It means I have to actually touch my fingerprint on the sensor when I want to do authentication next time. Now Eliza comes back. Tomorrow she goes back to trybank.com and she wants to log in again. Well, this time she hits sign in, and all she has to do is touch her fingerprint on the sensor. Again, we've had these kind of user journeys for the last 5 years, but only in apps. So now we're bringing it to the web, which means not only is this now a possibility on mobile devices, but it's also a possibility on the desktop or laptops, where we typically interact with services in a web-like fashion. So we've kind of brought parity, I guess, between the mobile and the native application and the web application world. Pretty straightforward here. And how did that work? Well, we just do a get. So the two calls that's important here is create, to make keys, and get, to actually get signatures back. And again, you just basically send in a pointer and say, hey, you remember that credential I registered earlier? I want to get a signature for that one. You want to verify the user, and it's as straightforward as that. What you can also do here that's very interesting is you can kind of use the same keys that you've used over on the website, you can also use in a native app. If you're the same publisher that owns both the application and the website, you can link things together so that Eliza, the next time she comes back and downloads the mobile app, can simply touch her fingerprint, and she doesn't actually have to go through all of the processes of rebootstrapping that application, because the keys we've created in FIDO land is shared between native app and web. Very, very important. What happened behind the scenes? Same thing as we said earlier. Pretty straightforward. You really just do the same kind of call, but in a native FIDO fashion. 2 case studies, and then I'm all done. I'll just show this briefly. This has been implemented by Yahoo Japan. They've seen a reduction in time here, about 37.5%. And then we've also implemented it, and actually we're in the process literally this week of rolling this out to users, where we've seen a huge reduction in both the failure rate of people not knowing their password, as well as a reduction in the time spent in actually doing password-based authentication. Implement this today. Follow me on Twitter for any updates, and I'll share the slides. Thank you, folks.